Greetings, Mr. Portnikov. Good to see you again. In good health. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Greetings, Mr. Gribin. Mr. Portnikov, here is a new city. The continuation of last year's diplomatic activity around the idea of ending the war that Russia has unleashed against Ukraine has begun. A meeting was held in Paris within the framework of American Special Representatives Kushner and Vitkov also took part in the coalition of the willing. They have not signed any accepted documents, only Ukrainians and Europeans have signed. Some say that this is the maximum that could be expected, and Ukraine has received it. Others say that it's all empty talk about nothing, nothing happens, it's all an imitator. All lies, the war continues. As you can see, you are in the dry balance, speaking in the language of chemists, yes, the results of this meeting. Please. Well, I think that when we talk about diplomacy during hostilities, we should always ask ourselves, how much this diplomacy really affects the cessation of hostilities? And the answer is very simple, does not affect. Because we are hearing from German Federal Chancellor Friedrich Merz that a ceasefire agreement must be reached first. In Ukraine, that is, an agreement has been signed that will guarantee that the war is stopped, and only then will some guarantees of Ukraine's security be involved, which are negotiated on similar forums. But the Federal Chancellor absolutely reasonably notes that this does not work without Russia's consent. Therefore, I keep asking myself why we voluntarily want to find ourselves in such a logistical trap. European countries constantly claim that it began with the relevant initiative of French President Emmanuel Macron, that they are ready to deploy their contingent in Ukraine after. How military operations will be stopped. At the same time, everyone agrees that military operations can be stopped only if it is achieved. This is a corresponding agreement with Russia. Because without an agreement with Russia, all these forums and conferences are purely diplomatic in nature. But they have nothing to do with reality. Russia, as you know, says that the ceasefire should be the culmination of a great peace debt, which is allegedly being discussed now by Moscow and Washington. And the President of the United States, Donald Trump, also agreed that it is not a ceasefire that is needed, but a full-fledged peace treaty that would guarantee the non-repetition of the conflict, at least for the time when it will be being in the White House. I think this is also an understandable task for the American president. At the same time, everyone understands perfectly well that there is no way to force Russia to agree to the presence of troops of NATO member countries on the territory of Ukraine, because the demands that Ukraine should not join NATO and be a neutral state, if at all it is possible to talk about any real demands of Russia, remains one of the fundamental points that are being discussed by the American and the Russian negotiators. And Donald Trump seemed to agree with the idea that Ukraine should not join NATO. But what difference does it make for Russia? Will Ukraine be a full-fledged member of NATO, or will it be a country on the territory of which the military centers of NATO member countries will be located, as was discussed at the conference in Paris? The Republic of Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. There is no difference. Therefore, it is clear that Russia will never allow the appearance of a peace treaty with Ukraine. If this peace treaty ever appears at all, I don't think there will be any treaty at all. A clause that would regulate the possibility of the presence of any foreign troops on Ukrainian territory, especially the troops of the Union, which has nuclear weapons in service with its members. And when we talk about what we are ready to provide, guarantees of Ukraine's security in the form of the presence of European troops. But in order for these security guarantees to be activated, a peace agreement with Russia is necessary, that is, its agreement with these guarantees. We thus make it clear. Ukraine, that no guarantees of Ukraine's security have been provided. Not if it was transferred from the diplomatic language of reality. That's why I ask, what is the point of all these discussions, when it's a struggle, of pointy pointers with blunt pointers in the Blafutka of the time of the journey there Limir Gulver. Jonathan Swift described it very accurately, by the way. While the pointy-nosed or step-nosed people were fighting over which side to break the egg firm, very real political events were taking place. And it's the same here. Keir Starmer says that he is ready to form on the territory of Ukraine a certain British Army of the Rhine, for example, the Army of the Rhine, which was once on the territory of Germany, thus ensuring security and peace in Europe after the Second World War. Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform Party, says his country has the financial and political possibilities to form such an army, that he opposes this decision. Everyone is discussing Mr. Farage's views because he may well apply for the post of Prime Minister of Great Britain after the 2029 elections. However, this discussion misses the most important, the most interesting point. And, in fact, if the UK believes that Russia's consent is necessary for the appearance of its troops, it centers on the territory of Ukraine, then why do we need political discussions between liberists and reformists? Then there will be no consent from Russia for the presence of British military centers on the territory of Ukraine. And I can absolutely guarantee that. Then the second question, and maybe the European countries are ready to lead your troops on the territory of Ukraine without the consent. Russia. But Russia clearly says these troops will be a legitimate target for the Russian army. I have no doubt about it either. If the leaders of Great Britain or France or other countries talking about the presence of their troops are willing to take risks, then they can conduct their contingents in the same way, already today, without waiting for the end of hostilities. And if they are not ready to take risks, then they should understand that even after the end of hostilities, their troops will not appear on Ukrainian territory. But this is the reality. Therefore, when we say that Ukraine got the maximum of what it could get, they really understand what it got. Except for another joint photo. For the time when the war ends, in a situation where there are no objective prospects for the end of the war. In other words, the appearance of these troops is reasonable to believe that it should not be after the war. After the end of the war, namely to end the war. Of course, to end the war, but at the same time, if these troops are not going to engage in any direct clashes with Russian troops, then their presence on the territory of Ukraine will have exclusively decorative character. Because they do not guarantee any security. But they appear some troops on the territory of, say, the western regions of Ukraine or the central regions of Ukraine. Who will prevent the Russian Federation from shelling these troops and, let's say, the military facilities where they are located? And who will then be responsible to the French or the British for the death of French or British soldiers? And the most important thing is another, and what will be the meaning of this death? If they are not going to engage in any clashes with Russia anyway, then their presence, again, will have a decorative character. Even during military operations. Mr. Portnikov, and yet, such background, well, if you look from the point of view of Russia's war in Ukraine. Background events, they still can't be said that they don't change anything. These are the events of Venezuela and events related to Venezuela, in particular. The story of the confiscation of 2 Russian tanks already by the United States Navy. And all this shows that the Russian weapons, the Russian flag, the Russian Navy, which accompanied these ships, is worth 3 Russian kopecks, actually. And after that, Russia also declares that it believes, that it demands, that it wants something, and does not want something. It's just already, well, when I look at social media, it's all already so the subject of a pretty cheerful attitude of the public. Yes, to all of these. The grumblings of an old grandfather, yes and no more. On the one hand, you are right, on the other hand, the seizure of a tanker without cargo by American Special Services. This, of course, is an important signal. But on the other hand, the question arises, what happens to those tankers that with a cargo of oil, Russian, or Iranian, or Venezuelan, safely proceed to the ports of destination? I also believe that the intensification of the tightening of sanctions against Russia should first of all be associated with the tightening of sanctions against the so-called shadow fleet of the Russian Federation. But we have repeatedly had clear evidence that the seizure of 1, 2, 3, 5 tankers does not affect the capabilities of the Russian Federation in any way to deliver oil to where it needs to be delivered. By the way, this applies not only to Russia, but also to Venezuela and Iran. And as far as I understand, no special operations of the Americans in Venezuela and no uprisings in Iran change this situation. Maybe she will change. I would like to hope so. But I don't think it will change from the loud statements of Donald Trump. I think that, for example, a change in the energy situation in Venezuela is possible only if a normal democratic government is established there, which will really control the country's oil industry and will be able to cooperate with a number American companies for investment in the oil industry of Venezuela. Then, perhaps, in the 30s of the 21st century, we will see a new picture. Because in order for Venezuelan oil to really take a new position on the world market, billions of dollars of investment, and the restoration of this industry, which is important for oil market. I think it will be more likely after Donald Trump, if it happens at all, if it is possible to restore democracy in Venezuela at all. So far, we do not see any real opportunity for Trump or his staff to even think about this topic. And there is a desire for a certain number of barrels of oil, which, in general, does not play a significant role in the global oil market. This is the first moment. The second point is the fight against the tankers of the shadow fleet. There are so many tankers that if the special forces of the United States chase after each tanker, they will have neither ships nor resources. Because these tankers are everywhere. And until some joint measures are taken to stop these tankers, perhaps there are closures of certain trade routes, straits, and so on. I think that all this will be primarily demonstrative of some kind. Donald Trump's actions are quite, I would say, beautiful from the point of view of commentary, but absolutely ineffective from the point of view of reality. I believe that if further measures are taken to export Russian oil, then over the coming years, there will be opportunities for Russia to enter real markets. Negotiations on peace in Ukraine. But I do not know in what year and in what decade this will happen. Maybe this year, maybe in 5 years. Again, it is important that Vladimir Putin himself. I realize the riskiness of my actions. And I have a rather serious impression that the Russian president is not ready to pay attention to the economy at all. And everything will end, as I have already said, not with a peace treaty, but with a big collapse of the very structure of the Russian economy and, possibly, the structures of the Russian state. I fully admit, Mr. Mygregan, that under the ruins of this state, and the humanitarian catastrophes that will follow as a result of its collapse, all the former Soviet republics that are in the neighborhood will be buried, as if under a layer of garbage. This is also a real catastrophe that threatens us no less than war. And Putin is clearly leading, I would say, his country to this abyss, dangerous for all of us. Of course, there is always hope, so we will close the borders, we will not do this, we will not do everything. But you know, Turkey probably also thought that it would close the borders in Syria when the outbreak of the civil war in this country began so serious. And as a result, it turned into a hotel for Russian and Syrian refugees. How can we not all become such hotels? Mr. Portnikov, next to our region, there is a huge country, 90 million Iran, which is now seething. And in general, there is a situation there. I follow the opposition Telegram channels, which directly distribute video footage from there. There, in general, well, let's just say, the paste has already come out of the tube, and it will not be possible to drive it back. Already there, however, it all started with the bazaars, But now the agenda of the bazaar is already forgotten, yes. There are political slogans. Javed Shah has become the main slogan there, that is, long live the Shah. There is a specific character, this is Crown Prince Recep Kelevi, who already appeals to Iranians on a daily basis. Moreover, gaining millions of views, the last one has already gained 80 million in a day, and the appeal was in Farsi. And the population of Iran is 90 million. Yes, that's it. In other words, this is a very important indicator of emerging trends. And here too, the Russian authority, let's say, subsides and reaches the bottom, we can say, because there too. A strategic alliance, like, yes, we will not give, we will not allow, and so on and so forth. What is happening, and how it can affect the global balance of power and our region. We are Iran's neighbors, we are Iran's neighbors. Azerbaijan, Iran's neighbors, Turkey, neighbors. Iran, Arab countries. And, of course, we receive information that the American Air Force is being transferred en masse to Iraqi Kurdistan and the Gulf Zone, military transport planes with unknown contents, and tanker planes. Israel is already openly talking about the increased possibility of a new war with Iran and so on. Your comment, please. I am absolutely convinced that there is a revolutionary situation in Iran. It's obvious. But now it will be completely different to what extent the power apparatus of the Islamic Republic is able to resist this revolutionary situation, first of all in the capital. This is going to be a really important moment, because it is obvious that for the majority of the population, the regime of the Islamic Republic is unacceptable. But this majority of the population does not have the power resources to overthrow the Ayatollah's power. And now we are going to see this, I would say, the effectiveness of the power regime. This is always checked during the revolution. That's when there was a revolution in Ukraine in 2013 to 2014, by no means the last factor in this revolution. As you understand, was that the power structures were not eager to preserve one of the most disgusting post-Soviet regimes, Erdogan Viktor Yanukovych. And when the 2020 year were similar to the revolutionary situation in the Republic of Belarus, was the Belarusian security forces are ready to shoot at their own people for the sake of another regime abhorrent, the regime of the Chekist puppet of Alexander Lukashenko. In other words, this is always what matters here, and we understand that there is already some kind of internal split in the Iranian elites. In the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself, we see that the president of the Islamic Republic, Masoud Pezeshkian, is trying to take a cautious position towards the protesters, while Ayatollah Khamenei, who has always been the leader of the most radical forces of the regime, in fact, calls for reprisals against him. Therefore, depending on who turns out to be stronger, the people's or the security forces, events in Iran will develop in the coming months. But this, in principle, will still mean a delayed crisis because the regime of the Islamic Republic has exhausted itself. Another very important point, which we really quite rightly mentioned, is the moment of the American presence. The President of the United States said that if the Iranian idols shoot at the people, the Americans can intervene in order to protect the Iranians from their own security forces. And I think that after the detention of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro, for Ayatollah Khamenei, and for his associates, and for the leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, all this sounds quite, I would say, convincing. Especially since you know that Nicolas Maduro was detained by the Americans by the special services on exactly that day, the very day on which the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, General Qasem Soleimani, who was one of the most vile terrorists in the region, was eliminated. Therefore, in general, in the determination of Trump firm the point of view, that's just such a shock. especially because there were strikes on nuclear facilities. The Islamic Republic can have no doubt in Tehran. And in this too, there will be such an intrigue of the actions of the Iranian security forces against the protesters in the near future. But it is clear that if it turns out that the Iranian regime will not stand, it will be a complete collapse of the Iranian one. The resistance, which, in fact, was almost destroyed by Israeli efforts during the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon, when the Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists were destroyed by precise Israeli strikes. And it remains only to regret that Israel was not given the opportunity to deliver definitively. Based on the activities of these terrorist banks, now the axis of resistance that Beijing created, in the form of its counterparties in Moscow, Venezuela, and Iran, may collapse. This is also quite a serious thing. You're talking about Russia, but I think about China, not to forget, because China buys Russian oil, China buys Iranian oil. China is buying Venezuelan oil. And all three disgusting misanthropic regimes of a criminal nature live precisely due to the fact that China is paying them off for oil products, actually helping these regimes to exist and fight. It is quite possible that the fall of the regime in Tehran, just as I hope the further processes of the fall of the regime in Caracas, will lead to the fact that Russia will remain isolated and will remain the only asset, the People's Republic of China, in its geopolitical confrontation with Washington. Mr. Portnikov, this is already my information in Tehran, as the epidemic is spreading rumors that the American Special Forces Delta, after the operation, a successful operation in Venezuela, is already in verbal and is waiting for the order. Dear Talahemini, a meeting with Nikolai Maduro. Yes. Nicolas Maduro. And this inspires them greatly. The Crown Prince calls on everyone to come out and conquer the streets of cities and the streets of Tehran. It is only important that, in this case, Trump does not then say that he does not know any Crown Prince, but wants to talk with the heirs of Italy, as it is now happening in Venezuela. Because we can expect anything from Trump. And this also needs to be remembered. You see, the problem is that the American Special Forces are doing their part, and Trump is not doing his. And in conclusion, Mr. Portnikov, on the eve of the American delegation, a large one visited Baku. But judging by the protocol pictures, it was quite numerous, and there was a meeting with Ilham. After that, there was a big interview with Ilham Aliyev, and he, well, let's just say, pleasantly surprised us with his unprecedented peaceful rhetoric. Those toxic norms, narratives, which were full of his usual public speeches, well, or slipped, this was not. Here's how you can explain it, this transformation, and is there a connection with the Iranian events as well? Well, I think that Ilham Aliyev has always been a pragmatic person, to put it mildly. And he is well aware that now his political success, especially after he and Nikol Pashinyan visited the White House in the office of Donald Trump, depends on good relations with the United States. And the United States wants to open communications, because this will also be an important geopolitical moment. First of all, for America, the moment of ousting Russia from the South Caucasus completely. The sooner Russia leaves the region, the more peaceful and stable it will be. And in this situation, of course, the road to the opening of communication is peace with Armenia. Let it be a cold world, but peace. And the Americans, I think, understand this very well too, and Olivia understands this very well. That's why we see such a development of events. I would very much like Baku and Lebanon to be able to move from this cold peace to a full-fledged peace, to a peace treaty, and to the normal existence of the two countries after all that catastrophic period that we all had to go through. Observing the South Caucasus at the beginning of the decade, you will remain hostages of this instability, which was largely generated by Moscow's efforts. Thank you very much, Mr. Portnikov, for accepting my invitation and spending time on our broadcast in your beautiful country. Peace through Paramoga. Glory to Ukraine. All the best. Glory to the heroes, good luck.